Hello and welcome back to the module on cultural new historicism and cultural materialism. Before we go on to before we further our discussions, let us quickly recap what we discussed in the previous module. We looked at the process of new historicism itself and looked at the practice of the practice and the mode of analysis deployed by the new historicists. We understood how they juxtapose literary and non-literary texts, reading the former in the light of the latter, and they try to thereby defamiliarize the canonical literary text and attempt to detach it from the accumulated weight of the previous literary scholarship, and they try to look at the text as if it were brand new. They also focus attention within both the text and the context on issues of state power and how it can be maintained on patriarchal structures and on their perpetuation and on the process of colonization and with its accompanying mindsets, etc., etc. We understood how the new historicist method also employs the post-structuralist outlook, especially Derrida's notion that every facet of reality is textualized and available to us in a textual form, and Foucault's own idea of social structures as something that is being determined by dominant discursive practices. Now, let us look at a practical example of new historicism. For this example, we will refer to Louis Montrose's famous work, A Midsummer Night's Dream and the Shaping Fantasies of Elizabethan Culture, Gender, Power and Form. Montrose, as we discussed in the previous module, is one of the pioneers of this method of new historicist criticism. Now, this bit of analysis appeared originally in the American journal called Representations, and this journal named Representations is basically the house magazine of can be considered as the house magazine of this movement of new historicism. Now, in the previous class, we looked at how Montrose gave us a famous definition of new historicism as something that centers upon the historicity of the text and the textuality of history. And this essay on Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream validates this pronouncement. His overall thesis within this essay is that the play creates the culture by which it is created and shapes the fantasies by which it is itself shaped. The core crux of the argument in the essay is that the Queen Elizabeth, the British Queen Elizabeth, could project herself as the queen who had whose virginity had mystical and magical potency, precisely because these images were itself given currency in the court dramas and comedies and the pastoral epic poetry of her own time. Conversely, the figure of Queen Elizabeth herself stimulates the production and the promotion of such work and imagery. Hence, in this sense, history is textualized and texts are themselves historicized. A simple modern day parallel to this phenomenon would perhaps be the way that images of masculinity and femininity, etc., in films that we see in films pervade our lives and offer us ways of representing ourselves. Films with their representative images of masculinity and femininity give us the role models which we can be trapped inside with, so that real life is seen to imitate the filmic representation of life. In the essay, Montrose also points out how the Queen was the head of an extremely patriarchal society in which almost all powers were vested in men, and the irony, however, is that this is a society that was nevertheless ruled by a woman who had, because of her position, almost absolute powers of life over all her subjects, including men. In Shakespeare's play, A Midsummer Night's Dream, there are several instances of a queen who is seen as mastered and thereby feminized. For example, we have the character of Hippolyta, who is the Amazonian queen, and she has been defeated by Theseus, whom she must now submit to and marry. Similarly, Titania, who is the queen of the fairies, is seen as someone who has defied her husband Oberon and is thus as a consequence humiliated by him. He administers a magic potion to her which makes her fall in love with the first thing she sees upon waking up, and as those of you are familiar with the play, you know that this is basically a lowly character who has the head of a donkey. She is also thus humiliated and ruled over. Throughout the play, there is much about the rights of fathers over daughters and the rights of fathers over daughters and husbands over wives. And we understand from the play also that the precondition of male desire becomes a sort of female subjection. The happy ending, the quote unquote happy ending that we see in the play A Midsummer Night's Dream, depends upon the very reinforcement of patriarchy. Thus, the very festive conclusion to Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream is in its celebration of romantic heterosexual union, which depends upon the success of a process whereby possessive mothers, unruly wives and willful daughters, etc., are brought under the control of husbands and lords, and in effect just the patriarchal mechanism. Hence, it is suggested that the play might be seen as implicitly treasonous, and this is because Shakespeare's comedy can be seen as symbolically neutralizing the royal power to which it seemingly pays homage. In practice also, patriarchy is maintained in spite of the presence of women figures at the pinnacle of power. This is done by, in this example, by constantly insisting on Queen Elizabeth's difference from other women. Now, this can be seen as a very familiar strategy even in modern times. For example, despite having a female leader at the helm of the Tory party, we are talking about Margaret Thatcher, of course. Despite this powerful female leader, the party did not revise its ideas about the role of women in society. On the contrary, under the rule of the Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher, reactionary ideas were in fact reinforced and strengthened. Thus, Queen Elizabeth's rule was not intended to undermine the male hegemony of the culture of her times, of her culture. If anything, the emphasis upon her difference from other women might have actually helped to reinforce it, just as we saw in the case of Margaret Thatcher. Thus, all the pageants and the plays of her time, of the Elizabethan time, transformed her, the image of Elizabeth, into a religious mystery and not a real woman. All this demonstrates what is meant in practice by insisting upon the historicity of the text and the textuality of history. And with that, we will stop our focus on the practice of new historicism, and we will now start looking at something known as cultural materialism. Cultural materialism is defined by the British critic Graham Holderness as a politicized form of historiography. What this means is that the study of historical material, which includes literary texts, of course, within it implies a study of historical material, including literary texts, within a very politicized framework. This includes the present with those literary texts that these literary texts have in some way helped us to shape. This term, cultural materialism, was popularized in 1985 when it was first used by Jonathan Dollimore and Alan Sinfield, who are perhaps the best known of the cultural materialists, as a subtitle for their edited collection of essays known as Political Shakespeare. They defined the term as a critical method which has 4 characteristics. So, Dollimore and Sinfield tells us in Political Shakespeare that the process of cultural materialism combines attention to the historical context, theoretical method, political commitment and textual analysis. So, you combine all these 4 features, and that is how you get an idea of the thrust areas of this phenomenon known as cultural materialism. Let us look at each of these 4 components in slighter detail. First, we saw how it emphasizes the historical context. The aim of this aspect of cultural materialism is to allow the literary text to recover the histories, to recover its histories, or to recover the histories that were repressed or lost, or which other kinds of previous study had largely left ignored. Secondly, the emphasis on theoretical method signifies its break with liberal humanism and the absorbing of the lessons of structuralism, post-structuralism, and other such approaches which had become very prominent since the 1970s. We understood how this emerged apparently almost a decade or so after its counterpart, the movement known as New Historicism. Thirdly, the emphasis on political commitment signifies the influence of Marxist and feminist approaches and perspectives, and the break from the conservative Christian framework which had till then greatly dominated Shakespeare criticism. And lastly, the stress on textual analysis means that there is a commitment to not just making theory of a very abstract kind, but to practicing it on mainly iconic and canonical texts, which continue to be the focus of massive amounts of academic and professional attention. So, it would consider as relevant history not just what happened about 400 years or so ago, but that of the times including our own, in which a Shakespearean work is produced and reproduced and consumed and circulated. Thus, in cultural materialism, there is an emphasis on the functioning of the institutions through which Shakespeare is now available to us in the present day, and that should warrant a look at such entities as the Royal Shakespeare Company, the film industry which makes remakes of, or which makes films based on Shakespeare's plays, the publishers who produce textbooks for school and colleges, and so on. So, all these entities become subjects of study and scrutiny when you look at the process of cultural materialism. Cultural materialism also borrows rather heavily from the British left-wing critic Raymond Williams, as well as instead of Foucault's notion of discourse. Now, Raymond Williams invented the term structures of feeling, and these are in his opinion concerned with meanings and values as they are lived and felt. Structures of feeling are often antagonistic both to explicit systems of values and beliefs and to the dominant ideologies within society. Structures of feeling are characteristically found in literature, and they are seen as something that is capable of opposing the status quo. For example, one could argue that the values in the work of such writers as Dickens or the Bronte sisters represent human structures of feeling which were at variance with the Victorian commercial and material values of its time. Thus, the result is that cultural materialism can be seen as something that is much more optimistic about the possibility of change, and is even willing at times to see literature as a source of oppositional values. How then is cultural materialism different from New Historicism? Well, New Historicism is often seen as merely the American counterpart of cultural materialism. Dollimore and Seinfeld, who we just quoted, also quote Marx in saying that men and women make their own history, but not necessarily in the conditions of their own choosing. According to Dollimore and Seinfeld, cultural materialists tend to concentrate on the processes through which men and women make their own history, whereas new historicists tend to focus on the rather suboptimal circumstances in which they are forced to do so. That is, it relies on the power of social structures and ideologies that restrains them to a great extent. Thus, what results is basically a way of a contrast between what can be seen as political optimism as opposed to political pessimism. Another key difference is that the new historicist situates the literary text in the political situation of its own day, while on the other hand the cultural materialist situates it within the present itself. And like we mentioned earlier, while new historicism was much influenced by Foucault, cultural materialism on the other hand borrows many of its ideas from those offered by Raymond Williams, whose structures of feeling contain the seeds from which grows resistance to the dominant ideology. To give you this in the form of a very funny example, let us look at what would capture the differences between the two approaches in a hypothetical evaluation of what would be their mutual responses to something like the English Civil War. So, in approaching and interpreting something like the English Civil War, the new historicists may find it extremely hard to explain how the English Civil War even got started, because they conceptualize a very repressive state power which would make resistance virtually impossible. So, they would be confused about how something like the English Civil War actually happened, and on the contrary this would be balanced by the cultural materialist, who would find it very difficult to explain how the war even ended, because in their evaluation, according to their structures of feeling, it constantly throws up new ideas which would seem to suggest that stasis or stability of any kind and finality of any kind is virtually impossible. Therefore, to sum up, cultural materialist critics often read the literary text, for example most often a Renaissance play, in such a way as to rediscover its histories or the context of exploitation from which it might have emerged. At the same time, they also foreground those elements of the work's present form and context which would have caused some versions of histories to be lost or repressed or ignored in the first place. For example, they would take into account the enormous appeal and the weight of Shakespeare's heritage in England's contemporary present day cultural scene, as we saw with the example as we saw in the example with reference to their reliance on other things that support this kind of entity in its present day circulation. Entities like the film industry or publishers or even a company that routinely enacts Shakespearean criticism, Shakespearean plays. Also, they work mainly within the traditional notions of the canon, on the grounds that writing about more obscure texts would hardly ever constitute an effective political intervention. So, while the new historicists would be interested in even an anecdotal text, a very obscure text, the cultural materialists work mainly within the notions of the canon to constitute effective political intervention. And with that, we conclude our discussion on new historicism and cultural materialism. For further reference, for further readings, you can look at the list that is attached. Thank you very much for joining me. See you next class.